Hello and welcome to Double Feature Reviews. I'm Libby.
I'm David.
And today is Barbenheimer Day.
Is that recognized by Congress yet, or are we still working on that?
I think we might still be working on it, but next year.
Next year.
So normally, this part of the podcast is where we talk about if we've seen these movies before. In this case, because they are quite recent and we have a bias against recent movies, neither of us has seen these films at all. And I think we sort of tried to avoid exposure to them once we put them on the list so that we could go into the films as fresh as possible.
Yeah, I mean, how long ago did we have them on the list? Not that long.
I think it's been a couple months.
Okay.
I can't exactly remember, but I think it's possible that this pairing is what generated the idea for this podcast in my mind. Because, as you know, you can't just have a movie review podcast. There's a million of those. No one will watch it. You have to have a gimmick to your movie review podcast. And our gimmick is 2 movies.
Yeah, I feel like I've always been interested in movies as a series. And I think we've had discussions about it for years, about the idea of how to combine movies into a series. I didn't know that this particular pairing was directly connected to your idea for the podcast.
Yeah, I can't remember how direct it was. I mean, definitely the reason the podcast exists is because I heard about the Children's Hour and Tea and Sympathy in very close proximity and watched them and was like, wow, these movies have a lot of similarities. But I think that the existence of a societally constructed, unexpected double feature came from Barbenheimer. And this is also a special episode because this series kind of already has a name. But David, if we weren't going to call this Barbenheimer, what would you call this double feature?
Yeah, well, I went with a title that's a real deep cut. I have titled it Pick Up Your Tiny Burden, which is a reference to a great song, one of my favorite songs of all time, There Is a War by Leonard Cohen. Where there is a war between the rich and poor, a war between the man and the woman. There is a war between the ones who say there is a war and the ones who say there isn't. Pick Up Your Tiny Burden is the opening line of the chorus. But both films are about the question about whether or not things are okay now or are they not okay now. And forces us to sort of confront problems that we might want to just not think about.
Excellent. I went with something that might be the subtitle for a book. In history writing, material history is becoming increasingly popular, including histories of things, like looking at global history through objects. So I have titled this series, A History of the 20th Century in 2 Objects. I think if you were going to pick 2 objects and you had to explain the entirety of the 20th century in those 2 objects, the atom bomb and Barbie are pretty good choices. So if people haven't seen one or both of these movies before, David, what do they need to know in order to understand this podcast?
Sure. Well, I have a short prod introduction for each one. For Barbie, in Barbie's dreamland, every type of Barbie and Ken doll spins a sugar-coated life they believe reflects the now perfect society of the girls that play with them. But when stereotypical Barbie starts facing some very real-world problems, she and Ken travel to modern-day California to meet the humans whose lives do not match the art on the back of the box. Oppenheimer, I have this epic biography of J. Robert Oppenheimer, inventor of the atomic bomb, tracks his journey from struggling physics student to one of the most famous and infamous scientists of all time.
And jumping into Barbie, this is a 2023 fantasy? Is that the genre?
It's definitely speculative.
Speculative film directed and written by Greta Gerwig. Greta's husband, Noah Baumbach, also wrote the screenplay. And in the cast list, almost every character is listed as just Barbie or Ken. I'm going to be adding some tags onto most of the Barbies and Kens in order to clarify who is who. So it stars Margot Robbie as Barbie, Ryan Gosling as Ken, Issa Rae as President Barbie, Kate McKinnon as Weird Barbie, Simu Liu as what I'm going to call Lacrosse Ken, because in the big Ken battle, he's using a lacrosse stick.
Seems like that's a pretty popular weapon among the Kens.
Yeah, I couldn't figure out what his thing was. It seems like the Ryan Gosling Ken is Beach Ken. I wasn't sure if all of the Kens had the job of beach.
I think all the Kens are Beach Ken, and Ryan Gosling is stereotypical Ken, just as Margot Robbie is stereotypical Barbie.
Okay. Michael Cera as Alan. America Ferrera in a role that I don't believe is ever named in the screenplay, but the character is named Gloria. Does that name sound familiar to you at all?
I feel like that was mentioned in the movie. I could be wrong.
I just thought of her as America the whole time. Maybe they did say her name and I missed it. Ariana Greenblatt as Gloria's daughter, Sasha. Will Ferrell as Mattel CEO. And Helen Mirren as the narrator, coming back to this podcast. The first person who is a double feature reviews, who was not in episode 3. Helen Mirren also appeared in Gosford Park, which we discussed in episode 2.
Episode 3 was a big episode for Double Feature.
Yeah, we didn't like Portrait of a Lady very much, but apparently we love all the actors from Portrait of a Lady.
It had a great cast. That wasn't the problem.
And normally I don't mention the production company in this section, but I think it is important to know that this was made by Mattel Films. David, can you tell us about the production and reception of Barbie?
Yes. Mattel started shopping the idea of a Barbie movie in the mid-1980s.
Do you mean a live-action Barbie movie? Because I know there are a lot of cartoon Barbies. Had cartoon Barbies already come out in the 80s?
Cartoon Barbie is largely a product of the home video VHS process, which wasn't in full swing at that time, but I think it started. I assume this was before the cartoon Barbies was really a product that was available for home video, and I'm pretty sure that this was supposed to be some type of live-action interpretation of the product. The current version started out development at Universal in 2009, didn't make a lot of progress. It ended up being moved to Sony in 2014. In 2016, Amy Schumer, the stand-up comedian, joined the project, was involved for 2 years with the plan for her to write the film and star in the film as Barbie.
Fascinating.
In 2018, she left, in theory, because of scheduling issues, but it was later revealed due to creative differences between her and Mattel. Greta Gerwig was brought in as the writer and director in 2021, and at her insistence, her husband Noah Baumbach also joined as co-writer. They started shooting in July of 2022, and it was released in July of 2023. I think we all know about the release as maybe the major cinematic event of 2023 with the Barbenheimer phenomenon.
And are you aware that it is not a coincidence that these two films were released on the same day?
How do you mean?
Christopher Nolan normally distributes through Warner Brothers. However, they announced during the pandemic that they were going to start releasing directly to streaming services and not having a dedicated theatrical period. Christopher Nolan did not like this. He took his project of Oppenheimer and went over to Universal. When it was announced that Universal would be releasing this on, I believe, July 21st, Warner Brothers, in order to punish Christopher Nolan, instead of airing some cartoon that no one's ever heard of, switched their big budget, high marketing campaign, blockbuster Barbie to the same date in order to take sales away from Nolan as punishment for his leaving them.
Yeah, Christopher Nolan is famous for his devotion to the traditional cinema and watching movies in a theater, just as he's famous for his devotion to practical effects. What was supposed to be counter-programming became weirdly synergistic programming. Both films became smash hits. Barbie made $162 million in its opening weekend in the United States and $194 million in the opening weekend around the world. So that's an opening weekend of $356 million. It went on to gross over $1.4 billion in total ticket sales, with $636 million coming from North America and about $800 million coming from around the world. Depending on how you calculate it, there's a profit of about $421 million. So it was a huge hit for the studio. Really financially successful for Margot Robbie as well. She probably made between $50 and $60 million from making this movie. It's the highest grossing live action comedy of all time. It's the highest grossing film by a female director. It's the first film by a solo female director to earn over $1 billion.
Is highest grossing film by a female director adjusted for inflation?
Maybe not.
Okay.
Is there something you're thinking of?
Not anything specific, but just, something. A 1980s dollar is a lot smaller than a 2023 dollar.
Barbie held the number 1 spot for 4 straight weeks, and it's also the highest grossing Warner Brothers film of all time.
Wow. Take that, Harry Potter.
The film was received really well. It has an 88% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. It was nominated for a ton of Oscars. In a lot of the categories, it was going up against Oppenheimer. It was nominated for Best Picture, Best Supporting Actor, Best Supporting Actress, Best Costume Design. It was nominated twice for Best Original Song, and that's in fact the only category that it won in for What Was I Made For. It was also nominated for I'm Just Ken. It was nominated for Best Production Design. It was nominated for a lot of BAFTAs, including Best Actress in a Leading Role for Margot Robbie, Best Actor in a Supporting Role for Ryan Gosling, Best Original Screenplay, Best Costume Design, Best Production Design, but didn't win anything at the BAFTAs. It has an IMDb rating of 6.8 with 549,000 votes.
That seems a little bit low, given that it's got an 88% on Rotten Tomatoes. I'd like to see a graph of all films with their Rotten Tomatoes versus their IMDb. An 88 on Rotten Tomatoes does not necessarily mean what people think it means. For people who aren't familiar with how Rotten Tomatoes work, could you explain?
Sure, yeah. So Rotten Tomatoes percentage is a percentage of the reviews that are positive. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't really track, are they really positive or only kind of positive? It's either thumbs up or thumbs down. Of course, a lot of the reviews don't have an official thumbs up or thumbs down, so the Rotten Tomatoes is also interpreting whether or not the review says it is good or it is not good. At the Oscars, it was going against Oppenheimer in Best Picture, Best Supporting Actor, Best Adapted Screenplay, Best Costume Design, Best Production Design. So these movies really were set up as rivals.
This Oscar season did make me think harder about some of the categories. I think it's really interesting that Ryan Gosling was nominated for Best Supporting Actor. He did lose to Robert Downey Jr. in Oppenheimer. But the actor categories are for a performance. And I don't think that Ken is a very good character. If this is best character, I don't think Ken is a contender. But I do think Ryan Gosling did a really good job performing the script.
I'd agree. I think it's interesting that it received 2 nominations for Best Original Song. That's kind of a rarity. Mm-hmm. Also, maybe a little bit interesting that I'm Just Ken didn't win, because it does play such a prominent role in the film and probably did make the biggest impression on audiences.
Do you know if Ryan Gosling was performing his own vocals in that song?
He was.
Interesting. Okay, it didn't really sound like him.
Yeah, I'm Just Ken is a Mark Ronson song, and Mark Ronson was involved with a lot of the excellent music in Barbie. I think one of the things that clearly stands out is how consistent the score and the songs that the characters sing really did contribute to the film.
Yeah, I do like the way music is used in Barbie, and it's used not... there isn't a consistent use of music. Like, you have I'm Just Ken, which is a diegetic song. You have sort of background mood-setting songs. And you also have the opening song, which is like narrating the actions of the Barbies.
I think this leads to an interesting question, which I really want your opinion on. A question we've asked before on the podcast. Is this a children's movie?
No.
Because, obviously, Barbie is a children's toy.
Yeah.
There's some childlike aesthetic that goes throughout the film. I think they expected a lot of younger people to see the movie. When we had a similar discussion on Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio, you said one of the reasons that it is a children's movie is that it contained songs, and that it was a musical where the characters were singing songs. So we've certainly checked that box. But apparently your answer is no, this is not a children's movie.
Yeah, so it is rated PG-13. So I think we've excluded the primary Barbie doll demographic. It ends with a gynecology joke, which I don't think would be funny to 6-year-olds. And I think a lot of parents might not want their kids to see it. Also, I think if they wanted this to be a children's movie, they would have cast a younger actor as Ken. Ryan Gosling is not the dreamboat of Gen Z. I was born in 1991. I think Ryan Gosling is kind of too old to be a dreamboat for my demographic. So I'm a sort of mid-range millennial. I think Ryan Gosling is the dreamboat for elder millennials and maybe Gen X. So Ryan Gosling is, I believe, 43. His sort of breakout romantic lead was in The Notebook, which released in 2004. So Ryan Gosling is not hip for the kids.
Yeah, I do think it's interesting how old the Barbies are presented, and to some extent how old they look. That's not really intended as an insult in any way towards Margot or to Ryan, but they don't look like young people.
I believe Barbie is canon 19.
That's right. Barbie is supposed to be a teenager, but
she's also a doctor and astronaut.
And the president.
And the president. Issa Rae President Barbie does have to be at least 35. Although she's not president of the United States. She's president of Barbie Land. What is President Barbie president of the United States? The actual doll that you can buy?
If there's one thing we know about the Barbie Land Constitution, it's that it's flexible.
Mm-hmm.
So, I don't think that was necessarily a big problem.
It can be changed by popular vote.
The opening narration really emphasizes the idea that Barbie is there as an adult woman who is there to present a model of being an adult woman to young girls so they can dream about their own lives as powerful adult women.
Well, the very beginning says you can dream about your adult life as hot, not as powerful and in lots of diverse careers.
What do you mean by in the very beginning?
I mean in the 2001 pastiche. So the movie opens with little girls playing with baby dolls. This is a tragedy because they can only imagine being mothers. And then a leggy lady in a strapless bathing suit shows up, slides her sunglasses down, gives what I assume is supposed to be a cheeky, but I interpreted as terrifying wink. I did not like that expression.
You don't need giant Margot Robbie in your life?
The biggest smile.
A
huge smile. It frightened me. Too many teeth. She shows up and all the little girls smash their dolls to bits. That is the beginning of Barbie. She then, as Helen Mirren tells us, goes on to take on all of these different roles as cool jobs that you can be a powerful woman in.
I think it was really interesting. I mean, you talked about the movie kind of being a musical. In some ways, this movie reminds me more of a mid-century film with the pacing and the structure of the story, with the smooth movement between spectacle and narrative, without a need to explain those transitions or justify them in the story. It's a very cinematic film in that conventional way. And I think it's notable, as you noted, just how many film references there are and just how much cinema and the history of 20th century cinema plays a big role in this movie. And it goes back to what you're saying about this is not a movie that's really directed at children. In fact, I don't even think this movie is directed at people who are in their 20s and 30s. Your millennials or Gen X or whatever you're trying to talk about that. This movie seems, in a lot of ways, marketed towards people who are middle-aged or seniors.
Can confirm, my mom saw it twice.
At several points, our leads go out of their way to compliment old people and just talk about how great they are, and it's totally fine that they're old. The real hero, the person who saves the day, Ruth Handler, is represented in her oldest form as a very old, as a distinctly old woman who describes herself as such.
She's a ghost, and in a lot of media, when you die, you get to become the young, hot version of yourself. But the ghost of Ruth is the old version of herself.
And a lot of the conversation is about how unpleasant it is that young people now find Barbie kind of offensive, when clearly we all know there's this truly wholesome and maybe problematic, but it's fine idea at the kernel of it. So it does seem like they know that America has an aging population, and their goal is to target that aging population. Seemed to work okay at the box office. But yeah, it does have a ton of movie references in here. It opens with a direct pastiche from 2001: A Space Odyssey, a film which the kids or even the millennials probably have not seen.
Yeah, I haven't seen 2001: A Space Odyssey. Sorry if this means I'm not allowed to make a movie podcast.
I'll try to keep the regulatory agents away from us for as long as we can.
Thank you.
There's also a lot of Matrix references with the which pill or...
Which shoe.
Which shoe, thank you. Which shoe will you choose? There's a Shining call-out. A Pride and Prejudice. We actually see Colin Firth up there on the screen.
And also footage from The Godfather.
That's right. That's an explicit plot point as well. So yeah, there are a lot of very intentional film references. Film references that are much more relevant to people who are in their 40s, 50s, and 60s than people who are teenagers or younger. I mean, there's the joke about how men love the film The Godfather, and that's the film they want to talk about. Well, that's not true for most men under 30. They haven't seen The Godfather. There's kind of a strategy here of appealing to older people by acting like their taste and their interests are still socially relevant to younger people.
Two more films that I wanted to add to your list of films that get referenced. There's Monty Python and the Holy Grail. When the Kens,
with the gallop.
They do the gallop.
Yes.
They specifically do the hands crossed
That's
when they're
right.
holding the reins, which is not how you ride a horse. You do not, maybe in Western style, but in English style, why would you cross your hands? This is a reference to the Monty Python coconut horses in Holy Grail. And also, I'm not positive, but I think that the dance battle that the Ken sort of beach fight evolves into is a reference. They're all wearing identical outfits, which I believe are referencing one of Audrey Hepburn's costumes in Funny Face, which the kids have not seen.
I don't think so. I think that the aesthetic and the visual quality of the film is really similar to Funny Face, especially the opening pink montage, which is the major aesthetic idea in the Barbie land as well.
Think
so
pink.
I would not be surprised if that was a intentional or unintentional reference, because I do see a lot of aesthetic similarities. It's a great dance sequence. It's really good.
If you liked it, you should go watch Funny Face for more. Little BTS, Greta Gerwig cast not just for that dance sequence, but all of the extras were dancers, because dancers have a very strong sense of movement, and she wanted people who could move like dolls.
Yeah. They don't stick to it all the time, but there are lots of times where the characters are intentionally rotating their neck or their hands or rolling around the floor when Margot Robbie has her personal breakdown and she sort of collapses. It's clearly an intentional doll-like reference. I mean, I like those parts of the movies where we got to live in doll world and see them work as dolls. One thing I found a bit frustrating was how inconsistent that logic was applied. You know, at the beginning of the film, we see Barbie sort of fly out of her house, and at a couple times they have our...
And Helen Mirren even tells us that Barbie is flying out of her house because when you play with a Barbie doll, you don't do the boring parts where she walks down the stairs and goes out the door. You just lift her gracefully from her bedroom down to the street.
I mean, I did. I feel like this movie makes me feel like I played with dolls very differently than other people. I must have been doing it wrong.
I played with dolls in the way I believe Mattel originally intended. So I did have some Barbies. This was 25 plus years ago, so I don't super remember what I did with them. But I believe I was mainly interested in outfit assemblage. And Barbie's original job is as a model. She's supposed to dress her up. And one thing that I remember is I had some non-Barbie dolls. You know, there were in fact other companies making dolls. And the clothes were not interchangeable. This was the bane of my existence. The fact that I couldn't get my knockoff Barbie shoes to fit on my Barbie doll.
Maybe you just had to flatten out those feet.
Yeah, Barbie, I checked and her feet are just as pointy as they were in the 50s. I did also check to see if Mattel made Ordinary Barbie, which Gloria brings up as the sort of Barbie they should make. And although Will Ferrell, in his role of Mattel CEO, dismisses it, one of his aides says, or maybe he's the CFO, says, actually, that would sell like hotcakes.
It wouldn't sell like hotcakes, and that's why they didn't make it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it was kind of fun to play around with the idea of a doll world and it wasn't quite clear if the humans were controlling them or if they were just sort of a platonic representation of the way they were being played with. At one point, our real world teenage girl says, "Do hands ever come out and grab you?" And they say, "No, that would be weird." And I thought that was really enjoyed that bit. But then sometimes it didn't work that way. Mm-hmm. And the movements and the activity were very much rooted in the Barbie world, and that sort of broke the immersion of the bit. So I feel like that would have been more successful if they had kind of stuck to it more.
I agree, and I'm going to go even farther, that the primary problem with this film is that the logic isn't consistent.
Yeah. So
what is Barbie Land? It seems to be many different things. Is it a result of how little girls play with dolls? This does show up in some cases, like Weird Barbie has her hair cut and burned and has random lines drawn on her face. In some cases, the Barbies move like you would move a doll through a house or, have her feed herself. And then there are other situations where it seems like Barbie Land is Mattel's vision of Barbie. So in the opening sequence, when we're meeting all of the Barbies, lawyer Barbie wins a case. I would be fascinated to know what the case was, what crimes happen in Barbie Land. And she says, "This makes me emotional and I'm expressing it. I have no difficulty holding both logic and feeling at the same time, and it does not diminish my powers. It expands them." No little girl has ever said this while playing with her dolls. This is an expression of Mattel's version of Barbie, Mattel's idea of Barbie. And then there are other situations where it seems like these are independent characters who have free will. So at the end of the film, Barbie apologizes to Ken, saying, I shouldn't have excluded you. Every night didn't have to be girls' night, because earlier she'd sent him away because it was girls' night. Which means that the character of Barbie decided that every night was girls' night. I had up to that point assumed that America Ferrera, who is in fact controlling Margot Robbie's Barbie, had decided that it was girls' night. And this was a reflection of what America Ferrera was doing, because so many other elements of Barbie's thought processes are established by what Gloria is thinking about. So when Gloria starts worrying about death, Barbie starts worrying about death. When Gloria starts worrying about cellulite, Barbie starts worrying about cellulite. So I have a really hard time thinking about this film because I don't know who's doing what.
Yeah, the lawyer you mentioned was arguing before the Supreme Court for a case that corporations shouldn't have the same free speech rights as individuals.
Oh, interesting.
And that was her closing argument. She hadn't yet won the case, but presuming from the fact that all the judges got up and clapped at the end, she was doing pretty good.
That's a really good sign at the Supreme Court, when they stand up and clap for you.
Yeah, I think the logical inconsistency is what drags down the film. This film spent a lot of time in production, and I think I'm guessing that a lot of it was going back and forth between how do we adapt a toy into a movie?
Well, there is the cartoon Barbie movies, which do not interface with the idea that there is a Barbie land separate from the real world, and Barbie is just a fully realized character with the normal free will that we expect from a movie protagonist.
Yeah, the film makes very clear that Margot Robbie is stereotypical Barbie, who is one of the Barbies, but is equally Barbie compared to everyone else. And in the Barbie stories, Barbie is a particular person. In fact, as the film is sort of talking around, the blonde, white, blue-eyed person. And then the other people are Barbie's friends, with presumably different identities, which don't qualify as much for the brand.
And I believe that the original dolls, when they came out with when Mattel came out with dolls of different races, they were not called Barbie. One of them is Teresa, and I don't remember what all their names are.
Yeah, I mean, there are a variety of Barbie-adjacent characters, but now there are Barbie, true Barbie, in multiple presentations of all different types. But yeah, I think we are seeing here Mattel sort of cleaning up some of the things that have been swept under the table there.
Have you seen the Lego movie?
I have seen the Lego movie.
Okay. Especially because Will Ferrell plays
He's
potentially the bad guy.
Of both?
He's a secondary villain, I would say, of Barbie. In both of them, Lego movie, which I haven't actually seen, was my main frame of reference for what the Barbie movie was going to be like. So I didn't expect the whole patriarchy plot line. I thought it was more going to be about dolls with existential crises.
Yeah, I mean, the Lego movie is a children's movie. It is very much directed at children. So I think you're kind of highlighting an interesting point about, is Gloria controlling Barbie or is Barbie controlling Barbie? And I think the answer is closer to the second one, but maybe neither. One of the problems with this interpretation is that there are clearly not enough Barbies to go around. We see and we kind of presume that there's between, 200 and 2,000 Barbies that exist in this world.
I would say that's a high estimate.
Yeah, it's not clear if this is the only metropolis of Barbie Land or if there are perhaps other communities that we're not seeing.
I mean, we get zoom out shots of Barbie Land and it looks pretty small. And the main thing that I think is weird is that there's also only one weird Barbie, and weird Barbie is what results when you play with your Barbie too hard. A lot of Barbies have been played with too hard or given haircuts.
So I think it's clear that these Barbies are platonic ideals, or we might just say the different products in Mattel's product line. And though Gloria presumably was playing with a stereotypical Barbie, and that's part of why her actions brought these problems into stereotypical Barbie's life, that is not to say that Margot Robbie's character represents the Barbie in particular that Gloria is playing.
I think she is. So Kate McKinnon tells her, you have to go find your owner, basically. You have to go find your person. And when Barbie gets to the real world, she psychically imaginates who her little girl is. And the big twist of the movie is that it's not the little girl, it's the mom. And also the girl is no longer little. She's 12 and hates Barbie.
Yeah, it almost is like it's a metaphor for who is this movie made for.
Yeah. Where
it's kind of implied to be made for the children, but we all know it's not made for the children. It's made for their moms. My interpretation of this, although this is not said explicitly in the film, but I feel like it's the only way to make the logic work, is that conceptually, stereotypical Barbie would be able to mind magic, or whatever term you use there, any of
Psychic
imaginating, thank you. Psychically imaginate any of the various people that had been playing with the stereotypical Barbie. That, again, she is not representing the individual Barbie that Gloria is playing with. Now, obviously, she's had this intense, somewhat traumatic experience with Gloria, so perhaps at this moment she does have an especially strong connection that makes it easier to navigate that. But I don't think we can make it work at all if there has to be an individual Barbie in Barbie Land for every Barbie, and as you play with your Barbie, you move it around in Barbie Land. There just aren't enough Barbies.
So I actually do think that there is a way to make it work, and that is that Gloria is the only person currently playing with Barbies.
That's why Mattel is so desperate to make this movie. We are down to one person
mom
owns each model of this, and no one else is interested. Well, that is a possibility.
Yeah, another problem with this sort of existential situation of the Barbies is that initially we are told that everything's great in Barbie Land. And it's through Gloria's hang-ups and insecurities, I made them sound kind of invalid. I think that they are valid. That Barbie starts worrying about death and developing cellulite. However, not everything is peachy in Barbie Land, or even salmon pink. Ken is already upset in Barbie Land. And I just want to know where did that come from? Because Ken is in love with Barbie, but she isn't that interested in him. Is this a reflection of how Mattel markets Ken, which is effectively as an accessory to Barbie? Is this a reflection of someone who is playing with Ken who feels that he is being misrepresented? That didn't really make sense. Or do these guys all have free will?
It is notable that everything's all right in Barbie Land, but there seems to actually be quite a bit of dissatisfaction among the Kens. So by everything is right in Barbie Land, they mean everything is right among the currently politically enfranchised member of Barbie Land, that is the Barbies. And, the Kens are there as guests, effectively. I
think the other Kens are okay with the situation. There's a little bit of conflict between Ryan Gosling's Ken and Lacrosse Ken, as we're calling him, it seems like Lacrosse Ken is also interested in Barbie, and we have a love triangle. But all of the other Kens seem to be just as, happy-go-lucky as the Barbies are.
Clearly, the idea of conflict, at least among the Kens, is not a totally foreign idea in the way that it is not at all part of the Barbie community of Barbie Land. I think maybe we are supposed to read between the lines and see Ken as perhaps being influenced by a person in the real world holding up a Ken doll and reading a men's rights forum on Reddit.
Ben Shapiro. Ben Shapiro has implanted this idea in Ken.
And so, we are maybe seeing instead of the implicit anti-feminism of the early 20th century, moving into the explicit anti-capital F feminism of the 21st century. So is this if I play with Barbies, am I supposed to imagine that Barbie lives in Barbie Dreamland and her and Ken are fighting about whether it's called the Mojo Dojo Casa?
Mojo Dojo, Ken's Mojo Dojo Casa House.
Thank you.
AKA Ken's Mojo House.
So is this now the official lore of the Barbie universe, or is this just a concept that exists inside of this particular film?
So if I worked at Mattel, what I would be saying is I would be trying to ride the Funko Pop train. So I don't think that of course, they're happy for people to buy them and use them however they want. But I think the angle that they are pursuing is that these are like collectible items. You get your lovely Margot Robbie in her pink gingham dress, and you display that.
That makes sense. It is interesting how much Mattel is sort of intentionally played in a villainous way here. Mm-hmm. The soft villain of the movie is Will Ferrell, who is the CEO of Mattel. Mattel is directly...
Well, they attempt to imprison Barbie in her box. And it's unclear what will happen to her when she's in the box. I kind of assumed that they would just take her back to Barbie Land, but maybe something more sinister would happen.
It is unclear what would happen. But the Mattel Corporation gets a pretty hard line here. They're called out on being a group of very privileged men who are pretending or exaggerating how much their work and their motivations are based around benefiting women and girls. And the Mattel office is displayed in this very villainous way. Again, a lot of distinct cinematographic references to The Matrix and Neo running around in his office and trying to dodge his pursuers there. And it has this intentionally ugly, all gray background. Even the Mattel logo is not shown in its bright red. Low lighting. And the people there are sort of, if not dissatisfied, certainly not excited about their work. They're not happy to be working at a toy company, anything like that.
And interestingly, there's a really brief exchange between someone who works at Mattel and an FBI agent. And we see a split screen of the Mattel office and the FBI office. And the FBI, not a place people think of as fun, is much more like cluttered and colorful. And the FBI's having a good time.
Yeah, so it is an interesting choice to have a movie not only based on a Mattel product, but produced by Mattel. Mm-hmm. This is a Mattel film where they cast themselves as the villain and are willing to sort of say, well, the real problem here is not with the Barbie product, it's with the Mattel Corporation. They're the real bad guys here.
You can hate Mattel, but you have to love Barbie. Barbie is also anti-Mattel.
Yes.
Don't we love that?
Yes. And, to some extent, as you referenced, this vision of Barbie being stuck in the box and Mattel wants to keep her in her box, it almost implies that it's your job to buy the Barbie and get her out of the box.
Free Barbie.
Barbie doesn't want to be in the box. Only you can get Barbie out of that box. So it's a very interesting choice for Mattel to just be willing to be the villain. And yeah, we are a bunch of men that only really care about making money. And would you like to pay us some money to see this movie? I guess it worked.
There were a couple of things, I'm sure there's things that Mattel took out. There were a couple of things that Greta was able to keep in despite Mattel's pushback. Namely the speech that Sasha gives in which she calls Barbie a fascist and says she has set the feminist movement back by 50 years.
Are you saying Mattel wasn't happy about this speech?
I know Mattel was not happy about that speech. If you're ready, this might be a place that I can connect it to Oppenheimer, because I think both of these films had pretty, I'm not going to say unnecessary, because obviously this film would only have been made if it was financed by Mattel, but some pretty stringent external controls that make them worse pieces of art. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in Oppenheimer once we do the metadata.
Get ready.
Oppenheimer is also a 2023 film. It is a biopic directed by Christopher Nolan, written by Christopher Nolan, based on the biography The American Prometheus by Kai Bird and Martin J. Sherwin. It stars Cillian Murphy as J. Robert Oppenheimer, Emily Blunt as Kitty Oppenheimer, Matt Damon as initially Lieutenant Leslie Groves. I think he gets promoted throughout the course of the film. Robert Downey Jr. as Louis Strauss. And then truly a million guys in ties. I'll just give you the highlights of people where I think you would have either heard of the character or heard of the actor. Kenneth Branagh as Niels Bohr. Tom Conti as Albert Einstein. Florence Pugh as Jean Tatlock. Casey Affleck as Boris Pash, Rami Malek as David Hill, and Gary Oldman as Harry Truman. And David, tell us how this got made.
So, as you mentioned, this is an adaptation of American Prometheus, The Triumph and Tragedy of J. Robert Oppenheimer, a book by Kai Bird and Martin Sherwin.
And they're both historians. Neither of them has a scientific background.
That's right, they're both historians. It was released in 2005 to massive acclaim in both the literary and the historical worlds. That's not
the world of history,
the world
academia?
of historians. The historians' world. And it won the Pulitzer Prize for biography or autobiography in 2006. Almost immediately, there was a lot of energy in the film industry. How are we going to adapt this? There have been other Oppenheimer, Los Alamos, Manhattan Project films and miniseries, but this was seen as kind of taking it up and adding a much more human dimension to the characters involved. In 2001, James Woods, Hollywood's most toxic conservative, joined the project, flew out on a private jet in the middle of the pandemic to pitch it to a lot of studios, and was able to get people to bite, including Christopher Nolan. So James Woods and Christopher Nolan are both executive producers on this project. As the project was really starting to move forward, that's when this conflict between Warner Brothers and Nolan really came into full view. Interestingly, he wrote the script in the first person, at least for the Oppenheimer segments, because he really wanted to show that the story was being driven by him, and this wasn't just a biography of the atomic bomb, but it truly was a biography of Robert Oppenheimer. He also said that the rivalry between Strauss and Oppenheimer was directly inspired by the relationship between Mozart and Salieri in the film Amadeus. And he wanted to bring that same energy and that same type of both personal and ideological rivalry into this film. The whole thing was done, as every Christopher Nolan project is done, with a very high level of secrecy, with actors not even knowing what role they were going to take when they joined the movie. So you were either in or you were out, and then you did what Christopher told you to do. Not perhaps totally different from the environment created at Los Alamos by Robert Oppenheimer. So we can see there's some type of kinship there.
I wonder if the actors went through the cast list and looked at pictures and tried to guess who they look most like. Because Cillian Murphy doesn't look that different from J. Robert Oppenheimer.
He lost a lot of weight to do this movie.
Oh.
And there's been some investigation. Yeah, but it's, in fact, the amount that he's lost is closely guarded because he probably did lose a distinctly unhealthy amount of weight to do this. So it looks like him now. Not sure what this says about Oppenheimer's health and body composition. But
he seemed like a man who was stressed.
No, you wouldn't. You're right. Photography began in February of 2022, and originally production was scheduled to last 85 days, but it was determined that this would cost well over $100 million, partially because there were so many people involved. So shooting was cut from 85 days to 57 days, which is incredibly fast for a movie of this size.
It's
with
3 hours long. Yeah, and it's not just 3 hours long, but it has one of the highest scene counts I think I've ever seen. So a lot of breaking down, moving around, going somewhere else, getting a new set of people for him to talk to.
I'm sure we're going to get into it, but it is really notable how TikTokified one highlight clip after another, at least is the intention. And yeah, it was very successful. Not as successful financially as Barbie. It's under $1 billion, $976 million in total gross, which makes it the highest grossing World War II film, the highest grossing biographical film. It's also the highest grossing film to never reach the number one spot at the box office. Most of the weeks it was out, the number one movie was Barbie. Mm-hmm. It made $100 million from IMAX, and this was one of the, Christopher Nolan has long been a friend of the IMAX industry, I think maybe since inception, with help to sort of push popular movies into the IMAX world. And the black and white sequences were one of the first, because, I don't know, 30% of the movie is in black and white?
I don't think it's quite 30%.
Yeah, but maybe a quarter of the movie is in black and white. And this is the first IMAX film to be shot in black and white. And they had to develop a lot of bespoke film for him to use. And
the physical film.
The physical film. And it was a modification of a design used for black and white shooting in the 1940s. So they sort of intentionally chose a film stock which would hopefully match the visual look. This is not how the film got made, but I'll actually say that I wasn't I really didn't like the look of the black and white sections of this movie. And I think it's partially done to be more attractive to a modern audience, where they turn the whites up really, really high. And so it kind of looks like everything is under, it's like a color picture that just happens to be under a really bright whitish yellow spotlight. So it doesn't stand out as black and white. But also it lowers the contrast and it lowers the level of intensity of that shade for everything in the shots. So I think it's, I don't know that that's the film stock. I think it's the processing and the way it's being shot to make it maybe more attractive to a color audience.
I actually think there is an artistic reason behind it, which is that all of the black and white sequences are sort of from Strauss's point of view. And Strauss is a very media, public-focused person as opposed to Oppenheimer. So it's meant to look sort of overexposed.
Yeah, I think it does look like a staged photograph for a newspaper, not like an artsy photograph in a museum. And maybe that does fit the theme better, but it's really not pleasant to look at. This was a huge hit with critics. It has a 93% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, but it was nominated and won a lot of Oscars. Nominated for a lot of awards, as we mentioned, against Barbie, including Best Adapted Screenplay, Best Costume Design, Best Production Design. It won for Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor for Cillian, Best Supporting Actor for Robert Downey Jr. over Ryan Gosling from Barbie, for Best Original Score, Best Cinematography, and Best Film Editing. At the BAFTAs, again, it was nominated for a wide array of things, including Best Production Design against Barbie. It won again for Best Film, Best Director, Best Actor for Cillian Murphy, Best Supporting Actor for Robert Downey, Best Cinematography, Best Costume Design, Best Editing, and Best Score. It has an 8.3 on IMDb with 750,000 votes.
That's a lot.
That's a lot of votes for a movie released last year.
So about these awards for Best Editing, it won both the BAFTA and the Oscar. I'm really conflicted about how to feel about that, because I think the editing was both very good and I hated it. Let me read you some notes that I made not while watching the film, but immediately after watching the film. They should have called it the 200 most important 30 seconds of J. Robert Oppenheimer's life. Not even Christopher Nolan is allowed to make a film over 3 hours. Let me look at a mesa. I have never felt so defeated by a film. I think, especially in the first 2 hours, before at about the 2 hour mark is when we do the testing of the bomb, when there's a real clear change in the cinematography and the pace. It's really clear that Christopher Nolan was given a hard time limit of 3 hours, and they needed to shave every microseconds that they could. Most scenes in those first 2 hours have no establishing shots, and the ones that do have extremely short establishing shots. And I think Los Alamos, which this wasn't actually filmed at, but the New Mexico desert, is a place of exceptional natural beauty, and I would have liked to be able to look at it.
Well, it seems I can certainly understand where you're coming from. I don't know that I have the same aversion to this style. I don't know that it's really fair to blame the editing for this process. It seems like that's squarely laid at the screenplay, because the screenplay is directing what we see. It's telling us a lot about what shots we care about and what shots we don't care about. Is setting this pace and including how much content's going to be included in the movie for the runtime.
I think the editor, Jennifer Lame, did a really good job. I think she was given an unnecessary constraint that she had to keep it under 3 hours. I think I would like this movie so much more if it was 3 hours and 4 minutes.
So when you said even Christopher Nolan is not allowed to make a 3 hour movie, you don't mean this is your restriction. You mean that even Christopher Nolan is not allowed by the industry to make
Correct.
a 3 hour movie to the detriment of the quality. You think it would be better over 3 hours. Yeah. The real question is, would they have made $976 million if it was 3 hours and 4 minutes? And the answer is, I don't think so.
Really?
I don't think so.
Well, once you get over 2.5 hours, you're cutting out one performance per day. Mm-hmm. So the big line is it over or under 2.5 hours? Mm-hmm. I think the difference between 3 hours and 3 hours and 4 minutes is not good enough to turn people away. Because you can still say it's 3 hours.
I think the movie has a lot of things in it that shouldn't be there. So
Yeah.
I don't think we need, though I do agree that maybe some more establishing shots could have been nice. I mean, I think it's fine as an artistic statement or style to not do that. And to some extent, we are sort of showing the experience of Oppenheimer looking back on his own life and not having all the context. He, maybe we might say, can only remember these specific...
I disagree. Because one of the, personal character traits that we're getting about Oppenheimer from this movie is his love for the land of New Mexico. J. Robin Oppenheimer knows what New Mexico looks like. He can envision it. I am not allowed to have that experience by the editing pace. Yeah, so I'm sure that there were scenes and storylines that got cut. I think we needed to cut maybe one more if they were given a hard limit of 3 hours in order to give every other scene room to breathe.
Yeah, I think it stands out to me how many people there are in this sort of chain of enemies. When Strauss is orchestrating this conspiracy, he has the Borden character, a classic Christopher Nolan name, of course.
Of course.
I can't even remember who's playing Borden in this film.
There are truly so many guys in ties with the same hairdo that I think the editor did a really great job, as I said. I am shocked that I didn't have any difficulty remembering who everybody was. I'm not sure that I would have been able to name them and list what institution they're affiliated with, but I definitely recognized them sufficiently to be able to understand and enjoy the film. William Borden is played by David Dastmalchian.
I don't know that I'm familiar with that actor. So, William Borden, and there's also Casey Affleck's character.
Boris Pash,
who is another sort of these agents working against him. And especially in this area of the movie, it really feels like we could have cut out some of these characters. And we don't need to list the specific chain of evidence from which the documents were leaked to this person and then given to this person. And then they wrote a document which was received by this other person. This is not entertaining, and it's not the point. I think we should have, in my opinion, removed the Borden character and just had Posh as the villain, the true villain under Strauss' command. And I think at several points we also, again, recap this chain of evidence and this handing of documents around, and we don't need that. So this really stood out as something where we could have saved a few minutes and put in some nice Mesa shots. I also will say, I think Casey Affleck's performance is probably the best in the film. And I'm ready to put him up for the 2024 Best Cameo, because I think his work was excellent. I mean, to some extent, he's just doing the Casey Affleck bit of being kind of creepy, but he's doing a great job of it and really making you both feel the fear that Oppenheimer realizes he needs to have of this person in the moments where he's interacting with him. But also,
Oppenheimer doesn't realize that he needs to be afraid of him while he's interacting with him.
I think by the end of the interaction, he does.
Okay.
Partially because Casey's so engaging and so electrifying in that threatening manner. His role was one of the few times I actually found myself engaged with the personal elements of what was happening on the screen, not just the historical context and the biography.
You already know who my favorite cameo in this film was.
There are a lot of cameos in this movie, so I can't say I do, maybe.
Obviously, Kenneth Branagh's Niels Bohr.
Okay. Yeah, well, I know you're a big fan of Ken. The Niels Bohr in this movie reminded me a lot of David Bowie in The Prestige. But I think it was good. I thought he did a good job. It really reminded me of David Bowie in The Prestige.
Yeah. I think Niels Bohr also gets given sort of the most poetic lines. He's there for theme, not for plot content, unlike most other characters. He gets to say, "You are the American Prometheus," which is the title of the biography.
It's the real title of the movie. But yeah, it is notable that, just like you say, that he is there for theme. He doesn't, unlike pretty much everyone else, he doesn't advance the story at all. Interesting with David Bowie that Cillian Murphy specifically cited David Bowie as inspiration for how he wanted to do his look in the movie, where he sort of modeled his mannerisms.
I didn't see that at all, but okay.
Not sure I see this, but I think what happened is secretly Christopher Nolan loves David Bowie, and all of his actors know that. Maybe that's what's going on here, but I don't know. Maybe Cillian's just a big Prestige fan.
Just to clarify the setup of the narrative, for people who didn't understand it or for people who haven't seen the film, there are two sets of flashbacks going on. There's two sort of governmental hearings, one of which is Oppenheimer's appeal for renewal of his security clearance. And we see scenes of that where he's being treated very belligerently. Those scenes are in color. And in color, he is reflecting on his life up to the dropping of the bombs. And then the interspersed black and white scenes are more, I would say, from the perspective of Louis Strauss, who is at a Senate confirmation hearing to be, I believe, Secretary of Commerce.
Yes.
And his black and white flashbacks are more recent of the post-bomb drop.
It is interesting that the more chronologically recent segments of the movie are the ones shot in black and white.
I thought that the Oppenheimer flashbacks and scenes were meant to be like, we are experiencing it in reality, and the Strauss scenes are, we are experiencing it on television.
That is, I think, the impression that I got watching the film to some extent. But interestingly, Christopher Nolan has said that he filmed the Strauss sequence in black and white because those are the objective sequences. That was his term.
Oh, I did see that. I think you're misinterpreting his use of the term objective. Like, he talked about seeing Oppenheimer from a distance. We're not sort of getting his perspective on the situation.
Right. I'm more saying his about the objective about the identity or personality of Oppenheimer, where the stories told in the parts told in color are about how Oppenheimer sees himself and his own interpretation of his identity and his personality.
Yeah, I think that's not what Nolan meant by the word objective. I think he meant, a lot of times we use objective to mean true. That's not technically what it means. I think in the black and white sequences, when we're seeing Oppenheimer, we are seeing him as an object, and in the color sequences, we are seeing him as a subject. Like, we get a lot closer to him. He also psychically imaginates some stuff about physics, and we get to see his thought processes, whereas we don't get to see that in the black and white sequences. Also, if you want to be super 101 about this, we could also say that because the black and white sequences are from Strauss's perspective, Strauss sees things in a more black and white way, and Oppenheimer is more nuanced. That's probably not what Nolan intended, but I think it is an effect that people might experience. So jumping back to what I was saying earlier about like an editing problem and a problem with how much information they're giving you, I mostly didn't find this to be a problem. And as I said, it's truly astounding how well I was able to keep track of everything, given how many characters there are and the time span and the fact that we're jumping around in time. The first scene where we meet Niels Bohr, I had more of a problem with comprehension, because what's happened is Oppenheimer, his physics teacher, professor, was mean to him and didn't let him go to Niels Bohr's lecture because he knocked something over during lab work. So he has injected his professor's apple with cyanide. And he sort of forgets about this, remembers the next morning, and decides that he doesn't actually want to kill his physics professor. So he runs back to the classroom where his professor is talking to Niels Bohr, who has picked up the apple, is looking like he's about to eat it. And there's several, I would say, not key pieces of information conveyed in their conversation during that scene. But I didn't know if they were key pieces of information at that point. Things that happen, Niels Bohr says, you can't lift the stone without being ready for the snake that's revealed, which he repeats to Oppenheimer when we see Niels Bohr again. We get the information that Cambridge, where Oppenheimer is currently studying, is focused on lab work, and Oppenheimer is better at theory. And of course, there's a big tension throughout the film between how far can theory take us and what do we have to do practically. And also the practical information that Oppenheimer should study with Born at Göttingen, which is where he goes next. I could not absorb any of this information, and I only wrote this down when I went to rewatch the scene this morning, because I spent the whole time going, is Niels going to eat that apple? I could only stare at the apple. I don't know how Niels Bohr died. Maybe he died because he ate a poison apple.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that they later emphasize how Oppenheimer's teacher is a real person, a very well-known scientist. And so, he's sort of presented as a faceless villain, which is kind of how Oppenheimer is seeing him in those moments. And it isn't towards the later part of the movie when Oppenheimer is sort of taking stock of all the things that he's done, that he is able to humanize him and see him as his own important figure in history, perhaps.
Another thing about maybe misplaced tension, which ended up not really being a problem, is a couple of times they bring up that when they do the test, they don't know what will actually happen when the bomb goes off. And it's possible that it will ignite the atmosphere and kill everything. This is brought up maybe 2 times, but in fairly intense moments. And I was kind of worried that the tension of the testing scene would be, is it going to ignite the atmosphere and kill everyone? Which I don't think is a successful moment of tension, because we know that didn't happen. And I think that when we got to that actual scene, they did pivot and they created a new element of tension, which was we're seeing all of the people in their different locations and the different precautions they're taking to observe the explosion. And the tension that I was feeling there, let me know if you were feeling the same thing, was, is anyone going to die or even just go blind from experiencing the explosion? Because I don't know if there were any casualties or injuries at the Los Alamos site. And there was Oppenheimer and a couple other people are in a shelter, and as the countdown is going, there's one guy in the shelter with Oppenheimer who runs out of the shelter to look at it, not through a window. And I was like, is that guy gonna die? Is that what happens? As it turns out, he was fine. And it seems like he was probably supposed to be there. But I thought that was successfully exciting and a good pivot from something that I think would have been less exciting.
I was surprised to see omitted from the movie that there were multiple deaths in the production process that occurred at Los Alamos. 2 different scientists, most famously Louis Slotin, but there was another one, Harry Daglion, I don't quite remember how to pronounce his name, who died due to radiation exposure working with plutonium that was used in the development of the devices. That's a fairly dramatic thing to happen in the story of Oppenheimer, and one which I think would have influenced his thoughts looking back and the community looking forward. So I was actually very surprised to see them not be mentioned at all in the story.
I wonder if they did film that sequence and had to cut it. This is one film that I would be very excited to see a director's cut of.
That could get real long.
Yeah, as long as I'm not having to see it in theaters and can pause and go to the bathroom whenever I need to, it's fine. Because I think, unfortunately, this movie is so fast-paced and we cover so many events in, any given 5 minutes. The only time when you can go and pee is during the test, which is the most visually impressive part of the film, and it's a shame to miss it. Films need to include intermissions.
It's vital. It's vital for the long-term success of the film industry, for the quality of the films that we put out, and for the health and safety of people participating in films. It's not good to sit in a chair and just stare at something for 2 to 3 hours. It's not good to do that at any time, and certainly not when you're watching a movie. In Japan, there was a lot of controversy about the fact that the actual bombing of Japan is not shown at all in any way in the film.
Yeah, I did think about that, and I was curious if that was going to be depicted. I mean, I would say the film is called Oppenheimer. The film is not called The A-Bomb, and Oppenheimer did not witness the bombings in Japan.
They are willing to sometimes kind of play with the controversial history. There's the personal conflict, challenges, whatever, between Oppenheimer and his mistress, I guess is the term, Jean Tatlock, and how their estrangement, Oppenheimer's relationship with his wife, likely was a contributing factor to her suicide or apparent suicide, because there are those who believe that Jean Tatlock did not die of suicide, but was in fact killed by American intelligence agents because they believe that she was trying to help leak secrets about the nuclear program to Russia. I don't have any knowledge about the historicity of these claims or Jean Tatlock's activities, and I just don't want to comment on them just because I don't know enough about it. But I was surprised to see that they showed, through Oppenheimer's imagination, multiple views of Tatlock's death, including one where there is a gloved hand reaching from behind, pushing her face into the water, sort of leaning into this conspiracy theory, for lack of a better term. So there, of course, it's not surprising at all to see this sequence. Every Christopher Nolan movie has to have a can I, but a normal man, save this lady from dying from suicide / murder? So,
or often drowning.
And drowning, that's right. So, not surprising to see it in this case, but there we're willing to, play with the controversial, not in a definitive way, but just as something to throw in the mix. But a lot of the other controversial things, it seems like they're kind of dodging, which is surprising.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, about the Tatlock sequences, I feel like this is, if I had to cut something, this is maybe a storyline that I would have cut. It is important to the plot to have Oppenheimer connected, have communist sympathies, have connections to the communists, but his brother was a member of the Communist Party. The man and woman who raised his son had a connection to the Communist Party. That was a weird scene, by the way. Kitty is clearly stressed by raising their son while Robert is working all day. He comes back, hears that the kid is crying, takes him for a ride, and then just stops by a friend's house and basically says, I need you to raise our son. I would say I found all of the nudity in the Tatlock scenes gratuitous. And also the scene where they are for the first time having sex, and he mentions that she stops to go look at his bookshelf, and pulls off a random book in Sanskrit and demands that he reads it. And it is the, I am become death, destroyer of worlds line, was the one scene where I was like, in no way did this happen. Every other scene in the movie, I'm like, I'm sure they don't have verbatim records of everything these people said, but I'm like, that could have happened. The I am death, destroyer of worlds scenes is so weirdly artificial that I don't think it belonged in the movie.
Yeah, I don't think I would hire Christopher Nolan to direct an erotic romance. Mm-hmm. And for Jean Tatlock, who is an important person in history and obviously had a very complicated and difficult life, I think it is disappointing how insensitively she is portrayed in this movie. I mean, in the scene you're talking about, that whole sequence is there just to show that, like, she's weird. And I don't know if she's got it all right, because she's kind of weird, which is not a nuanced or particularly accurate portrayal of this person. And, Jean Tatlock is, I think, first of all, your point's fair. I think that we could have removed this. We don't need it for the plot. We're already struggling with runtime. I think that's perfectly legitimate. I think on the other hand, it also kind of downplays that she is an important person, a very important person, not just a burden in Robert Oppenheimer's personal life and in the story of this process. It was Jean Tatlock who actually inspired the name of the Trinity test. In the film, Oppenheimer is quoting John Donne, and this kind of implies that the name comes from John Donne's poetry, but it was Jean Tatlock that introduced Robert Oppenheimer to John Donne. And you would think if we're going to have this connection, that would be a natural place to draw it. So it seems like Jean is really just here as a weird lady that takes her clothes off character. We're not really interested in portraying her as a person or in a figure of the story. And I was pretty unhappy about that.
While we're on the mythological theme, I did feel like there was a little bit of tension in that we are attempting to create a metaphor, both one metaphor in which Oppenheimer is Vishnu and one metaphor in which Oppenheimer is Prometheus. And I think this also demonstrates a serious lack of understanding of the Prometheus myth, because in the Prometheus myth, Prometheus bringing fire to the humans is good. Like, the reason he is tortured is because of the selfishness of the gods. Whereas in Oppenheimer's situation, this is an internal torture that he is bringing on himself because he thinks the bomb is bad.
Yeah, it seems like maybe that's there to show the tension between the way the world sees Oppenheimer and the way he increasingly comes to see himself, where initially he is celebrated for inventing the bomb, and they show his real speech where he's celebrating its use. And so in that way, he is seen as the Prometheus who has brought peace through this tool of destruction. And,
I don't think it's accurate to say that he is celebrating its use. He is being celebrated for its use.
Well, in that speech, he's celebrating its use, where he says, I don't know how the Japanese felt about it, but I know they didn't like it. And thank God for the atomic bomb and other stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously don't know the actual person of J. Robert Oppenheimer, but it seemed pretty clear that in the film, he is saying that because he has to say something for all of these celebrating people, but he is having a terrible time. He's got that is when he imagines people being hit by the bomb and sees the skin shredding as it does from extreme radiation exposure.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that Oppenheimer is, and probably historically was, struggling with this internally about whether it being a good thing or a bad thing. But, the historical fact is that for decades, Oppenheimer tried to ride this successful view of him doing a good thing and tried to go along with it and gain as much profit and personal and professional gain as he could. So I'm sure there is an internal conflict there, but as a public figure and as a personal person operating in the public life, there is this middle segment where he wants to be celebrated. He wants it to be a good thing. He wants to be the Prometheus. I do agree that he's never tortured for it because the people above him are mad at him for helping other people. Mm-hmm. So in that way, it doesn't match the Prometheus story.
I think the film, and maybe you disagree, the film is presenting the torture he experiences as internal, not external, even though he is given a pretty rough time by a lot of higher-ups in various presidential administrations.
Yeah. This is part of why I agree with your interpretation, and this is why I don't fully appreciate this hard distinction we're doing between Oppenheimer's personal journey and his experience in the renewal hearings and the experience of Strauss in his confirmation hearings. That they're shot in different color schemes, mm-hmm. that they're shot in totally different ways, and that there's the characters largely appear in one section or the other section, and there's a big, moment when one moves from the color world into the black and white world, because I don't actually think these are very distinct stories. Mm-hmm. And they don't even present a very different picture of Oppenheimer. Strauss is supposed to be giving this more insightful, less sugared view of Oppenheimer's life, but then we're getting that same view in the color sequences. So yeah. I wonder if it would have been better if there was less of a distinction between those moments, and if the Strauss sequence were just another one of the events that we were covering in our story.
Yeah, I think we don't really get a sense of there being two distinct sides to Oppenheimer, the public and the private persona. I think we do get a sense of there being two sides to Strauss, but both of those two sides are presented in the black and white sequences. He appears to be helping Oppenheimer, but actually he secretly hates him. And he gets a classic villain speech at the end, which I'll quote. He says, Oppenheimer wanted to own the atomic bomb. He wanted to be the man who moved the earth, ... He'd do it all over. Why? Because it made him the most important man who ever lived. And I think this is a beautiful moment of storytelling, because the bad guy accuses his opponent of the sin he himself is guilty of, because I don't think this is actually true, but what the film presents as the primary conflict between Strauss and Oppenheimer is that Oppenheimer said something to Albert Einstein that made Albert Einstein not even mean mug, but ignore Strauss at one point. And Strauss is convinced that Oppenheimer said something. When we finally actually see that scene at the very end of the film, they're not talking about Strauss at all. They're talking about physics.
Or sociophysics.
That's true.
Something like that. But yeah, they're talking as physicists, mm-hmm. as inventors of great and powerful things. Mm-hmm. And so yeah, this is where I don't think that this distinction that the film tries to tell you it's giving you, where the color sequences are sort of Oppenheimer and we're looking at it, we get his side of the story, and then the black and white sequences are these more objectives. Well, this is how it really is. Mm-hmm. Now Oppenheimer's not here, so we can all talk about him and just say what the real deal is. But again, we're presented with a pretty fair amount of the real deal in the color sequences, mm-hmm. and a lot of the black and white is us retreading those same ideas.
Yeah, so I get that that's what Christopher Nolan was intending, to have it be a subjective and an objective pairing. I interpreted it in a different way, mm-hmm. Which, as I said, was the two equally subjective perspectives of Oppenheimer and Strauss.
Yeah, I think that's closer to what actually happens. And again, Christopher Nolan is going around saying that one is the subjective and one is the objective, but I don't actually think that carries out. And I think if there was less weight put into that, it would be easier to digest what's going on the screen. The film, I think, has great presentation in its visual design. I do think there were some great, obviously there's a lot of people, I do think there were some supporting actors in Oppenheimer. I already mentioned...
I agree, Casey Affleck.
Casey Affleck, who I thought did a great job. I also really liked the guy who was playing Robert Robb, the sort of prosecutor guy.
That's a very tough role. I would believe, I mean, maybe less than Oppenheimer, but I bet he has the most words that he has to deliver.
Oh, maybe.
Because he talks fast, angry, overwhelming. Roger Robb is played by Jason Clarke.
Roger Robb.
He did do a great job.
Jason Clarke did an outstanding job, again, as a villain, comparing it to Casey, one of the characters we're really not supposed to like, but we fear him, we appreciate him, we understand where he's coming from. He's entertaining to watch. Jason Clarke, I guess maybe he's most famous for Zero Dark 30, where I thought he did a good job in, but he was so... I don't know if charismatic is the right term, but so engaging in this role. And I was looking forward to coming back and fighting him some more. Casey Affleck, I guess, might qualify for best cameo.
Yeah, I think he was only in one scene, and then there's a couple flashbacks to that scene.
But Jason Clarke's a supporting actor, and I think his performance is 3 times as good as Robert Downey Jr.'s. I think that's a fact.
So now this is the point where we normally talk about why we picked these movies. However, in this case, we didn't pick these movies to go together. So, do you think that these films work as a double feature? Do you think one of them would be better paired with something else?
I think they work well as a double feature. I think it's based on their subtle themes and their historiographical role as documents of the 20th century, which are good things to have a film series about. Maybe not what I would normally pick for the podcast, because you're going to have to listen to the whole episode to understand where we're even coming from this, although that's going to happen in some future episodes.
We do have an episode planned with that exact problem.
I don't know that I would have said, these should be the double feature. I think they work great as a double feature. They're both films about existentialism, about whether or not the enemy is from the outside or on the inside, about recognizing that your society actually has a lot of problems, and becoming the hero of something that's problematic is not always a good thing to be. Sometimes you need to fight against something, but sometimes you don't really want to.
I think also there's the relationship between the conceptual and the real. Barbie Land and Oppenheimer's imaginings of how physics works, and him as a theory-based practitioner versus the real world of Los Angeles and the bomb actually created.
They're both movies where the protagonist kind of starts out as a high-performing person who's just kind of going along with the system, but then
ends pretty naive.
And then ends up sort of leading an army to accomplish a goal in secret. So the storylines aren't actually that different. So I think they work well as a series, and I'm happy to do them like that. Obviously, it's Warner Brothers' attempt to get back at Christopher Nolan unsuccessfully that led to it, so that's not why maybe they got paired, but I'm happy to do them as a double feature. In a way, the more interesting question is there a better double feature for each of these movies? I think they definitely work as a double feature. I mean, social media has already made that point for us.
I definitely don't think I would think to pair these two together, even if I had seen them. I'm not sure what I would pick for Oppenheimer, but you mentioned a lot of similarities that Barbie has to The Matrix. I think maybe Barbie and The Matrix would be a better double feature than Barbie and Oppenheimer.
I think for Barbie, I think there are 2 really strong contenders, and we've both mentioned that they've been mentioned already, which are The Matrix. I think there's a lot of intentional reference to The Matrix, and it's basically the same story. I think that's more or less fair to say. So that would be a very natural pick. Another very natural pick, which you mentioned earlier, would be Funny Face. Not totally different in their story. Another story about a high-performing person who has to sort of almost unwillingly fight for feminism, I guess would be an interpretation.
Funny Face is kind of Barbie in reverse.
Yes, in that she becomes a model.
She starts out as a nerdy philosopher and becomes a glamour icon.
Well, she kind of comes back around at the end, but that's a separate discussion. And obviously there's a big aesthetic similarity with both films. At the opening, aggressively celebrating the color pink, which is a great color to look at. It's maybe the best of the colory colors.
I
think that's fair.
didn't love the pinks in Barbie. I much prefer the Think Pink pinks.
Yeah, I agree. They are almost more magenta than pink, and I think that didn't look as good. I think the Think Pink is a better color.
Yeah, I think in Barbie Land, some colors are more faded and some colors are extremely bright, perhaps creating a world where the objects have been acquired over time. You know, this is maybe an actual person's assemblage of things, and some of the dresses. I thought that Margot Robbie's first dress, the pink gingham, was quite faded, and I didn't really like looking at it.
Yeah, pairing Oppenheimer, I don't know what comes to your mind as another...
Spitballing, maybe Frost Nixon, which is about, you know, what can you get on camera. I think Christopher Nolan wants Oppenheimer to be paired with Frost Nixon, because it's got that objective, subjective angle. But I think that was the element that was least successful in Oppenheimer.
I do agree that is Christopher Nolan's potential intention here, which we read from the quote we were discussing earlier. But I also don't think that it actually succeeded. I think that was one of the cases where it really missed. So, I don't know.
Yeah, I might want to pick a film from the 40s.
Maybe. Yeah, Oppenheimer is a... where I will give it credit, and I think it's true for both movies, is that they're pretty unique. Mm-hmm. They are not just standard films, either in the way they're delivered or in their concept.
Yeah, and I think notably, I would call Oppenheimer a tragedy. And you don't get a lot of modern films that are tragedies.
The only tragedies you can get away with making are either artsy or historical. Mm-hmm. You know, either you're targeting at a select audience that's willing to appreciate a tragedy, or you can just sort of make the point where it's like, well, a sad thing happened.
Yeah. So now we will reveal that the order that we talked about these films in is not the order that we watched them in. We, due to our schedules and when we could watch a long film and when we could watch a more normal length film, Barbie's an hour shorter than Oppenheimer, we watched Oppenheimer first and then Barbie. I think that, especially if you're going to watch them back to back, you do need to watch Barbie first and then Oppenheimer, because for me, as I said, I have never felt so defeated by a film, which doesn't mean I disliked it, but I just feel like I wouldn't be able to do anything after watching Oppenheimer, even watching, you know, a light snack like Barbie, which I think some people might consider it. You might come into it thinking of it as the main course and the dessert, but I don't think that's Barbie is more substantial than a dessert, and Oppenheimer will kill you.
So, Schindler's List is my answer as the pairing for Oppenheimer.
For Oppenheimer, not Barbie.
Another,
iconic pink coat.
Right. That's fair.
Little girl iconically pink.
Yeah, I think Schindler's List is another World War II biopic, epic, that plays with color and black and white photography and is a mix of an inspiring story and a deeply disturbing tragedy. So I'll say I think Schindler's List would be the ideal pairing.
Mm-hmm. Okay. But also, man, if you're watching those back to back, that's a rough day.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I didn't make the movies, but you're not wrong. So, to answer your other question, yeah, you should definitely watch Barbie first. I would say it actually requires more emotional engagement than Oppenheimer does. And at the end of Oppenheimer, I don't think you were going to be that interested in watching a Barbie. I think your mind's going to be in other places potentially. And yeah, Barbie is not that refreshing. It's not that positive of a story.
No.
You know, you talked about Oppenheimer as a tragedy, and Barbie is sort of, it's not presented as a tragedy, but it's not actually, for what it's worth, that happy of an ending. We don't fix the problems of the world.
David, she gets a vagina.
Yeah. I think it's interesting to compare Barbie in this sense to Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio.
Okay.
Barbie at the end sort of chooses to give up her own mortality in order to become a more real person. Chooses to give up her immortality in order to become her own real person. And I actually found the Ruth Handler scenes strikingly similar to the
death scenes?
Yes, played by
Tilda Swinton,
not Cate Blanchett. So it's not that happy of a movie. I mean, it's kind of fun, but I would say it's more energetic than Oppenheimer for sure. But it's not actually that much of a barrel of laughs.
I mean, fewer people die.
It's not even that funny. I mean, it's funnier than Oppenheimer, but it's not as we hear.
I mean, I would say Oppenheimer is zero funny, so any amount of humor is going to make it funnier than Oppenheimer.
That's true. But so to your point, I don't think it really works that well as a dessert. Mm-hmm. I think Barbie is going to make you kind of excited about movies. Mm-hmm. And you're going to need that excitement to get through Oppenheimer. Not necessarily because you're going to hate it. I enjoyed Oppenheimer. I think it's a good movie. But you're going to need it because it's long, it's intense, there's a lot of content, and it's definitely not a comedy. So, yeah, I would say Barbie first is the way to go.
Okay, now we're actually done. And here's future Livy and David to tell you what movies we're doing next, because we don't know right now. But first, I do have an answer to a question you asked that I didn't have a very good answer to in the last episode. That is, what should we pair Oppenheimer with? I could only come up with Frost Nixon, but I think actually Creation, starring Paul Bettany, is a good choice, which is a biopic about Charles Darwin. So if you want your controversial scientist biopics, that's the pair.
Interesting. I feel like those movies have very different morals, but that doesn't mean that they couldn't be paired together.
But anyway, for next episode, it's the Summer of Love. David, what movies are we doing?
We are doing Portrait of a Lady on Fire from 2019. It's a French movie, so that's the English pronunciation.
The French pronunciation is Portrait de la jeune fille en feu.
Thank you so much. We're also doing Call Me By Your Name from 2017.
The French title of that one would be Appelez-moi par votre nom, but it's an English film, so we don't have to worry about that.